How's it going, everyone? My name is Matthew McFeeters. I'm a neurosurgery resident at the University of Buffalo, and this is High Yield Neurosurgery. Let's talk about how to prepare for a residency interview. During my time in medical school, I was in a dual degree MBA program. Now, what many people may not realize about business school is the emphasis they place on the recruiting process, and specifically preparing students for interviews. And what I learned is that interviewing is a skill, and like any other skill, it requires practice and preparation. Now, where you train for residency is going to be one of the most important decisions you make in your medical career. And in order to get there, you need to have an interview. But my experience in interviewing students over the last several years has shown that many students show up to their interviews unprepared for what's about to come. In this video, we're going to talk about how you can prepare in order to ace that interview. So how do you prepare for your residency interview? We're going to talk about 4 different areas that I would recommend you focus on to help in preparation. The first is knowing your application. The second is knowing what makes you unique or memorable. The third is knowing what is important to you in a residency program. And finally, we're going to discuss how you can prepare to answer some of the most common questions you're going to be asked during an interview. So let's start with knowing your application. You may be surprised how many medical students show up to interview day, and when they're asked a fairly straightforward question about something on their application, they're not able to come up with a clear and coherent answer. Now, this often revolves around areas of research, but it really pertains to any part of the application. As a general rule of thumb, if it's on your application, it's fair game for someone to ask you questions about it. So you need to know your application front and back. You need to know your personal statement, your board scores. You need to know about your research projects and the extracurricular activities and volunteer experiences that you listed on your application. Now, specifically regarding research, if someone asks you a question, you should be expected to know the purpose behind that project, the methods behind the project, the results of the research, and then also what was your actual role in that project. Now, as you're going through and knowing your application, what you need to identify is what makes you a strong applicant that's going to turn you into a strong resident. Now, there are certain metrics that programs are going to use as screening criteria for giving you an interview, things like your board scores and your clerkship grades. These are not the things you want to identify that make you a strong resident. If you're at the table interviewing, you've already proven that you have the scores needed to succeed as a resident. What you want to focus on is what's going to make you a strong resident, because being a good resident goes far beyond just having the brains for the job. So where on your application can you identify your history of showing the character qualities of a strong resident? Things like grit and determination, resilience, the things that are going to make them know that you can go through the long hours of training, or the things that are going to demonstrate your compassion and your empathy that will tell them how you're going to be able to have those difficult conversations with patients and their families. Those are the things you want to emphasize and bring out as what's going to make you a strong resident. Now, it's important to know what's on your application, but just as important in knowing what's on your application is knowing what's not on your application. Are there any potential gaps that someone's going to ask you a question about? For example, if you're applying to neurosurgery and you have minimal or no research experience, you can bet that someone's going to ask you a question about that and why you don't have that experience. These gaps in themselves may not be a deal breaker. What's more important is that you can demonstrate that you've identified some of your weaknesses, some of the gaps in your application, that you've thought about them, and you can clearly articulate an answer to how you're going to overcome these weaknesses and still become a strong neurosurgery resident. Remember, everyone has weaknesses, and the difference between a good applicant and a great applicant is that the great one is able to identify their weaknesses and demonstrate what they've done in the past and will continue to do in the future to overcome these weaknesses. Now, the next point I want to talk about is what makes you unique and memorable. Remember that when you're interviewing, the person on the other side of that table has probably reviewed hundreds of applicants and is certainly interviewing several applicants that day. And at the end of the day, when those interviews get together and they discuss the applicants, everyone is going to be remembered by some point, even if that point is their particular non-memorability. So how do you make yourself stand out? One of the easiest ways to do this is to identify something on your application that's unique or memorable. This may be an extracurricular activity or a prominent research publication that you were involved in. What I would recommend is trying to find a way to make a connection with your interviewers. In psychology, there's this phenomenon known as reciprocity of attraction. Essentially, one of the easiest ways to get someone to like you is to demonstrate that you like them. So how can you do this in an interview? Well, before you show up for an interview, there is a good chance that you can identify at least a few of the individuals who you're going to be interviewing with, such as the chairman or the program director. What I would recommend is you do a little background research on those individuals and find some point of connection with them that you can then bring up during your interview. Now, one of the easiest ways to do this would be based on a physical location. It may be their hometown, where they went to college or residency or something along those lines that you can find common ground with and bring up during your interview. But ultimately, it could be anything. Say you knew you were going to be interviewing with me. How could you try and build a connection? Well, you could go to my department's website and look at my bio, and it wouldn't be too hard to find out that I'm from Minnesota. Maybe some point you went on a canoeing trip in the Boundary Waters or went on vacation on the North Shore of Lake Superior. That's something you could bring up during your interview in order to make a connection with me. Or you just do a simple Google search. Many faculty now are on Twitter or on Instagram, or residents are on social media. You look, you see photos of me, and you see that I have a Bernese Mountain Dog. Maybe you also had a Bernese Mountain Dog when you were a kid. That's something else you could bring up just to make a connection. This simple act of making a connection demonstrates that you had the interest to get to know me, and you can bet that I'm going to remember you in a more positive way. Beyond knowing your application and making yourself memorable, one thing that's incredibly important is knowing what's important to you in a residency program. Now, this may include things like the location of the program, the cost of living there, the research opportunities, and there's several other factors that are important to this. This is going to help you in at least a couple of ways. The first is that during your interview process, you're often going to be asked if you have any questions. And if you know what's important to you in a residency program, you're going to be able to craft thoughtful questions to ask your interviewers. Second, it's going to help you evaluate a program and help you make the best decision when you're creating your rank list. And as a side note, I can't stress enough how important it is for you to take the time to honestly evaluate the programs after you interview with them. What I would recommend is the same day of your interview, you sit down and physically write down what you liked about the program and maybe some of the things you didn't like about the program. Now, I tend to be hyper analytical in many of the aspects of my life. And when I was making my rank list, I actually built an Excel model to give me some sort of objective measure of how I was going to rank my programs. If you would like to see a demonstration of how this model works, I'm going to go ahead and create a separate video for that that's going to be linked down below in the description. And if you like the model, go ahead and subscribe, follow me on Twitter, and send me a direct message, and I will send you a copy of that Excel model that you can use when you're building your rank list. But let's get back to how to prepare for your residency interview. And the last point I want to make is how you can effectively prepare for common questions that you're going to be asked. Everyone knows, or at least they should know, that you're going to be asked some typical common questions. Why do you want to go into neurosurgery? What are some of your strengths? What are some of your weaknesses? Now, what I want to discuss is a way that you can improve how you answer these type of questions. I mentioned my experience in business school earlier because there's a simple technique that I think you can use to help answer these questions in a much more effective way. This is called behavioral interviewing. Now, in the business world, behavioral interviewing is a technique used by interviewers to more objectively assess someone's future performance by assessing how they've acted in certain situations in the past. Now, with these types of questions or these types of interviews, there's actually a right and wrong way to go about answering them. Even if your interviewer isn't intentionally using a behavioral interview style, I think you can use this technique to come off as much more eloquent and prepared for your interview. This technique is something called the STAR method, and it's an acronym that stands for situation, task, action, and result. This framework is used to build a structured narrative to answer a question. So situation, what is the context for the story you're about to describe? Task, what was required of you to do? Action, what did you actually do? And then result, what were the outcomes of the action you took? So let me give you an example that I actually used back when I was interviewing. During my third year of medical school, I was looking for a part-time job. I just happened to see on YouTube an ad for Khan Academy that they were looking for new content creators in the area of health and medicine. Now, what was required is that you had to submit to a video to a contest in order to get the job. I'd never done anything like this before, so I went down to the university bookstore and I purchased myself a digital Wacom drawing tablet. And over the next couple of weeks, every night after I finished all of my studying, I would search the internet for tutorials on how to use the sketchpad, how to record my drawings, as well as the audio, and then edit the videos together. Ultimately, I created a short video on Mendelian genetics and submitted it to the contest. And about 3 weeks or so later, I was driving home from work when I started getting a call from a number from California that I didn't recognize. I pulled over and I answered the phone, and it happened to be someone from Khan Academy saying that they liked my video and asked me if I would be interested to fly out to San Francisco and work with them for a week and meet Sal Khan and learn their techniques. Ultimately, I was fortunate enough to be selected and offered a position as a content creator with Khan Academy. And then over the remainder of my time in medical school, I worked part-time creating these videos, and ultimately some of my videos on topics like cardiomyopathy, diabetes, bronchiolitis have become some of the most popular videos on YouTube in those categories. So let's break down the STAR technique in this response. So situation: I was looking for a job and happened to see a job posting for Khan Academy. Task: I had to create a video and submit it to a contest. Action: I took the initiative to learn a new skill set and submitted to the contest. Result: I was able to get the job and have a pretty significant impact in my work. Now you can see that I created a whole narrative around that allowed for a more interesting discussion to a fairly simple question. Now, how can you develop these type of narrative responses to several different questions you may be asked during your interview? Now, the great thing about this technique is you can use the same situation and craft it with just some small changes to answer almost any question. So what I would recommend is that you think back on your time in medical school. Identify 5 to 10 significant events that you had that you can then build responses to. Now, these events may be an impactful patient experience. Maybe you gave someone a very difficult diagnosis, or you had a really difficult patient who was upset with how their care was. Maybe some interaction with one of your residents or an attending that you are working with. You think about that experience, then you build a narrative around it. And then you think about how that narrative can be tweaked or changed a little bit here and there to be adapted to almost any different question. Then when you have these 5 to 10 different scenarios, you have plenty of material to work with in your interview. Then the last thing you need to do is just prepare and practice. Have a friend or a parent ask you these types of questions, and then you can then craft your response. And I guarantee that if you can use this technique, you are going to come off as one of the most eloquent and well-prepared applicants during your interview. Remember, where you train for your residency is going to be one of the most important decisions you make in your medical career. So don't leave it up to chance. Take the time to practice and prepare for your interview. I hope you liked this video. If you did, go ahead and hit that thumbs up down below and subscribe to the channel. And good luck with your interviews, and don't forget to check out my video on how to create your rank list.